take a look at these comic pages. There is a lot wrong with them, and even though it's totally acceptable to draw comics like this at one point or another, I think that this falls very, very short in terms of what it could be. So, by comparison, we have something that looks like this, which is quite a bit better, substantial improvement, some actual lighting and shadows. However, this is still a level at which a lot more could be achieved by using lighting and composition techniques. And here is where I currently am. These are some recent pages from my comic, and in this video I wanted to go over a bunch of examples and talk to you guys about how I utilize lighting and composition in order to create much more effective storytelling and visually striking panels in comics. So welcome to my art studio. If you're new here, I am Cosmic Spectrum, and I am currently working full-time on my dream project, which is a comic series written and illustrated by me called Gloamingvel. And as always, thank you so much to Squarespace for continuing to support my art channel. Okay, so before I jump into Grimoire Noir to show you guys a bunch of examples of things I learned along the way, things I could have done differently, something that I would definitely change looking back, like weaker areas, stronger areas, and just kind of the trajectory of my learning how to utilize composition and lighting better as I went along through the 250 pages of this comic. But before I get into that, I guess I should just quickly define what I mean by composition and lighting in case some of you guys don't know what I'm talking about exactly. So I'm basically talking about composition in terms of placement of elements within each specific panel of the page, but also of the whole page itself, and sometimes even a double page spread as a unit, as a composition unit. And as far as lighting goes, lighting is basically something that is the utilization of light and shadows in order to enhance things like mood, focus, and emotions of the scenes. So hopefully that was concise enough. And yeah, so basically, because this was my first major comic project, I didn't really know exactly how to approach many things, but I did my best, and along the way I learned a lot about how to utilize shadows. I think most of the improvement that I made overall were in terms of lighting. As far as composition goes, I think like it's still fine, but there are a lot of things that I picked up that I brought into my current comic project, which is Gloamingvel, that I will talk about a little bit later in specifically I will go over in detail through the prologue to kind of explain some of the things that I did intentionally in order to strengthen the storytelling. So basically, the first point I want to make about Grimoire Noir is that, like, before I continue, I don't think it's bad at all or anything like that. I know at the beginning I pointed at some of my older work and I said there was a lot wrong with it, which is true, but you know, I still think it has a lot of value, and just because it's not perfect doesn't mean it's bad, but I'm simply talking about ways that things could be improved. So this is a good spread actually to talk about. So one of the biggest things that I ignored for a very long time when I was working on Grimoire Noir is the tonal composition of the backgrounds. So a lot of the times I would simply just kind of skip certain major background elements and use a simple texture overlay in order to, you know, add some sort of interest, but not spend too much time on the backgrounds. And to some degree, this was an okay choice, but a lot of the times it kind of left the characters looking slightly disjointed from the backgrounds, and there's quite a bit of that going on in the first several chapters probably. And I was very afraid of going too hard tonally on the backgrounds, so I was very kind of picky with what I chose to put a tone on, and as a result there's a lot of empty looking spaces, and I guess compositionally some of the scenes end up looking slightly incoherent, and they could have been made a lot stronger if I simply just used more tones or tonal variations. So one of the things that I am doing differently now, very differently, is one of my favorite tools to combat this is gradients. So I will often put down a bunch of gradients while selecting a panel, just to subdue all that white in the background, especially when a scene is looking super flat. And like I said, it's not bad. Like, I definitely think this is a great panel. I like it a lot, but it could have been a lot stronger if I simply added a tone to the house, because it would have kind of broken down the scene instead of having all this white with just a car as the focal point. And I would have probably tried to create a little bit more contrast between the characters and the house. Before I continue, let me tell you about my sponsor, Squarespace. As a full-time professional artist working from home, having a portfolio website is crucial for bringing in new clients. Social media definitely plays a part, but it is not a sufficient replacement for a portfolio website, because having to post frequently can really stand in the way of curating a proper gallery that is a good representation of my work. And so, as a solution, I've been using Squarespace for years in order to show my work to potential clients. The galleries are super easy to set up and organize, and it only takes minutes to update when I have something new. This website also serves as a main link hub that is super useful to anybody who is interested in my work, so they can easily find information on how to contact me, view my shop, my comic website, and social media channels that are not the ones they have found me through. So I highly recommend Squarespace if you're looking for a place to host your website. You can get started for free, and when you're ready to launch your brand new website, you can go to squarespace.com/cosmicspectrumart to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. And now back to the video. Anyways, this is just a quick example of something that I could have done differently. And so moving on, I wanted to show you the first panel in which I preemptively spent more time thinking about it. It was kind of an important panel because it introduced a bunch of characters. And so here, this is where I properly started to think about lighting as a tool to create a mood more specific to the scene, or to kind of like enhance the mood of the scene. So for instance, in this case, I wanted it to look a little bit sinister, and I didn't want, like, I wanted the focal point to be clearly here right at the center, but also it's just an interesting type of shadow where you have a bunch of faces kind of hidden, but then a lot of brighter areas near the bottom, and then some underlighting for the faces as well to create the sort of sinister atmosphere. And I did spend quite a bit more time on this panel than other ones, but I think that's why it ended up looking much more striking, and it's still one of my favorite pages out of the whole book, all these years later. So there's that. And after I did this page, I was kind of started to consider adding a little bit more tonal variation to the backgrounds, because I noticed how much of a big difference it makes. And so as you can see here, I'm trying a little bit more things on these couple of panels in the subsequent pages, but overall still I use just a textural backdrop to characters pretty frequently. And I think going back, if I had to redo this again, as far as tones are concerned, I would definitely use a more contrasting tone in the background, so that the characters would stand out a little bit more. But like I said, this is not like the end of the world or anything. It's just now the way that I approach things have changed quite a bit since the time I spent working on Grimoire Noir. And one of the goals is one of the biggest goals I have in general for comics is immersion. And I do think it's really important to very carefully consider the lighting of the tonal composition of the whole scene, including the characters, if you really want to get that immersive feeling, because I started to notice it being way more effective in much later pages, which I will show you right now. Actually, wait, no, there's one more example of things being kind of all over the place. So this chapter is one of the worst offenders to me, because it would have been so simple and actually very quick, basically actually no extra time at all, to just put a different tone, a darker tone in the back, especially since all the characters have rim lighting, because I was thinking about the lighting and there's an open window, and so I put rim lighting everywhere, and it would have been so much more effective and the characters really would have popped if the background was just darker, in order to really have the contrast of the rim lighting and a slightly darker tone of the background. And yeah, it doesn't exactly bother me, but I definitely think that is something I would have done differently if I were to do this all over again, because it's almost like a wasted effort to put all this time into putting rim lighting where it kind of ends up blending into the background in half the panels and you can't even really see it. So it's much less effective this way. And so moving on to where things started to get better and I started to finally clue into actually using tones for the background. So somewhere around here, as you can see, I'm no longer using just a texture, but I'm also including some tone. So there's some marked improvement for sure. But I really finally got a chance to utilize this properly in this much darker lit scene where, again, we have a sinister mood, which is part of it. Obviously, like when you have a bit of a shift in tone and a darker lit scene, it is necessary to use more tones, and so that forced me to get better at tonally distributing where things are in the background composition. So, and this also immediately helped to create this feeling of immersion that the character is really in this world and they're not just like more detailedly rendered and are like floating above these weirdly lit backgrounds or not lit backgrounds. So yeah, and as you can see here, it looks so much more atmospheric and it's really aiding the mood of the scene and the storytelling. And yeah, I just think it's definitely, this is where I started to improve quite a bit. And I really did notice that the feeling of immersion heightened so much. So after this scene, in subsequent chapters and everything else, I tried to put as much tonal variation in the backgrounds and to like have it kind of work for the story as much as I could. And yeah, it slowly started to get better. Like, see how much of a difference it makes when there are tones put into the floor and the different objects, and there's some gradients here and there to kind of just like help the whole scene come together, versus at the very beginning we have all these empty white spaces and like everything is just kind of, the characters are mostly floating in something that vaguely resembles background. I mean, maybe that's putting it too harshly, probably, but still, I think there was definitely a marked improvement, and I would mostly describe that improvement as just feeling like you're watching like an animated movie or something, like where your brain can really fill the gaps and like you can imagine what this would look like if it were an actual scene, versus the beginning it looks a little more of an abstraction, like there's less connection between the backgrounds and the characters. And so just the very last bit of examples here where I'm starting to do a lot more effects that are also kind of joining the characters with the background. And obviously it's because it's raining in the scene, there's a lot of water, but I do think near the end I managed to get a much better grasp on coloring, and also brought some more color in, because I mean, for the most part, this whole comic is relatively monochromatic, but near the end, I was feeling brave and I started to bring in little bits of color here and there more and more. And this really kind of paved the way for me to doing Gloaming Veil now in full color, which is something that I would have never even attempted back in the day because it just seems so intimidating. But there's not a huge difference between having a monochromatic or more or less monochromatic comic like this and having a full color comic, as I have discovered while working on the several pages that I've been doing, or basically the latest chapter is what I'm working on. So that's about it in terms of Grimoire Noir. I mostly talked about lighting and tones, which is part of lighting, but I think it's huge. And so when I talk about, like in the next part of this video, I'm going to go over the prologue of Gloaming Veil, and I'll talk more about composition, leading lines and things like that. So yes, and quickly, just before I leave, I am actually now posting new pages of Gloaming Veil on my Patreon account, so please check that out. And let's move on to the next part of the video. Alright, here we go. So we're at the next part of the video, and before I get into it, I'm gonna tell you guys a quick sad story about what happened not that long ago. So I basically recorded this whole video trying out this new mic that I got, like a lapel mic, so that I could have better audio quality, and the worst thing happened. So it basically stopped working in the middle of the video that I was recording, which I didn't even know about. And not only that, there was a huge chunk of missing audio, so I had to basically redo everything completely. But also, the chunk that it did record sounded terrible, so it wasn't even like it improved the audio quality one bit. And so here we are now. Hopefully this audio is not too bad. It's definitely a lot better than the lapel mic. And so I'm just gonna, yes, I'm going to go over the prologue, like I said, and tell you guys about some of my compositional choices, and I'll talk about lighting here and there. So, yes, the first thing I wanted to talk about was the lines of action, or leading lines. I think they're called leading lines in this particular context, where you're essentially using compositional elements like different things like limbs or hair or whatever elements a scene may consist of in order to lead the viewer's eye around the page and get them to look where you want them to look. And a lot of the time it's not just limited to drawing attention to one place or like a focal point in a panel. It's also about leading the eye through the entirety of the page. So in this particular case, we have this kind of framed situation right here, where obviously the focal point in this panel is the tree, but then also the elements around it are sort of pointing downwards and funneling your vision to the next panel. And the same thing is happening again, where the hand is almost pointing to this area right here where you can make your way around, and this line goes straight into here and ends right at the wounded eye, which is like the most basically kind of like shocking, I guess, element of this panel. Or you can also put it in a way where it's about storytelling, where obviously the thing to note in this panel is the limp hands, you know, obviously, so they are the things that stand out. And then here the notable element is the circle of mushrooms, which is a strange thing, and that's the thing you're supposed to notice. And here, obviously, the strangest thing about the scene is the wound and the missing eye, or whatever's going on here. And that's how you kind of use these elements in order to aid the storytelling first and foremost, and secondarily it leads the eye around the page as well. So these things kind of tend to work together in tandem, which is why I think composition is so important specifically for storytelling. And I will also say that these were not actually even super they weren't intentional choices that that I concocted while I was drawing the thumbnails. It just so happened to work out this way because my primary concern when I draw thumbnails is that you know what's happening, like it's clear what's happening. And then the secondary concern is it looks good. And I think in my brain, the it looks good part tends to just fall under the compositional category, or like the shapes that I end up choosing. And so I keep tweaking things until they just look good to me, which I can't always explain necessarily, but looking back on them, it actually reveals a pattern where I make a lot of subconscious choices about composition. So that's kind of neat to find out post fact. So this is a much simpler page with just 2 panels, but obviously here there's not too much to explain, but there's still an element of, kind of a leading element where this leads you to this, which is the most important part of the image. And then everything else just kind of fades into the background. So highest contrast is right here, and everything else is secondary. And that's pretty straightforward. And obviously story-wise, it also makes sense. And another thing I wanted to mention is the rule of thirds is a thing that is mentioned a lot when it comes to compositions, and I think it's a very good thing to keep in mind. But I've also seen sometimes discouragement of using like a focal point being in the exact center or something, and like things being more dynamic when things are placed off center. That's definitely true, but it's one of those rules that I break like all the time. I don't even know if it's an actual rule, but I really like placing things in the center sometimes because it just has that immediate impact, and with certain scenes it just makes a lot of sense to do something like that. And in this particular scene, I think that was basically the only choice, because otherwise it would have had a different sort of mood. Anyways, moving on. I think I'm pretty much just gonna go over most of the pages here with you guys because there's a lot to talk about. So here we have a general line that you can kind of go like this, like through the whole page, but also there's like a funneling effect where everything is kind of looks like it's being funneled into the mouth, into the throat, and then this was like actually more intentional, of course, for obvious reasons. And then because it's sort of like a dream versus reality sequence, I made this panel like overlaid with the two panels and even added a bit of shadow underneath it to just make it more like a dual reality type of situation, where I don't really do that in any other parts typically when things are taking place in the real world with no dream sequences. And yeah, one thing I'll mention, I actually really wanted to have this scene like kind of shatter. Like in my storyboards even, I had a crack, like I had cracks coming from this point, but it just looked kind of weird, and I don't know, I wasn't sure how I felt about it, so I just left it as intact. But maybe sometime in the future I can use some sort of little animation to create that shattering effect, but I digress. So moving on to the next couple of pages. This one's straightforward, but again, super simple, 3 panels, entire page. You have a line that goes across like this, more or less, and then you have some empty space or like less detailed spaces where eyes can rest, and you can really just look at the details and take in what's going on. So that's simple. And something like this here as well, as you can see, there's kind of a through line that just goes in this general direction, so I'm not going to linger on that. It's pretty similar in most cases. And then so one other thing that's tonal, and yeah, I guess it's more about tones and lighting. So the contrast between the character and the background is always a super important thing that I pay attention to. So the silhouette of the character versus the background has to be tonally different. There has to be tonal contrast. And a lot of the time it's easy to achieve that. Like, you don't have to contrive stuff like this because, well, maybe sometimes you do, actually. That's not true. Sometimes you do. Yeah. But in this particular case, like, because I imagine that he would be on the other end of this little tunnel, the lighting does make sense that he would just show up as a silhouette on the other side. So that was very easy and not super contrived because it just made sense with the scene. And of course here as well, we have the darker, slightly darker figure with some contrast with a lighter background. And even looking at it now, I could have made his silhouette even darker here. That would have been totally fine as well. These are just little things, right? And then moving on, I know we've got a little bit of a directional thing going on. And in the next thing, I really like the composition in this page because, again, it's a very kind of, you know, there's the foot that kind of points this way, and then we've got this situation, or like right here, there's a line, and then you kind of circle down to keep reading with the mushrooms. And this works obviously both on the story level and on just the simple page prettiness composition level as well, which is super satisfying to me. And there's plenty of kind of less detailed areas as well to just rest on, which is always important for me to make sure I do, because I have a bit of a tendency to put too many details. And this is another example where even though same scene, but you can have different lighting from different angles, right? So from this angle from behind, you have their silhouette against the lighter background, whereas maybe from the side, the two characters look like are tonally a lot lighter than the background. So then you always have a contrast where the character is clearly visible and there's no confusion as to what's going on. But at the same time, they still feel like they're firmly placed within the world and the background and the scene that they are in. And there's no feeling of characters like popping out against the background too much. So that's kind of the balance that I try to keep. And it's a little more detailed, maybe more details than some people are willing to put in, probably, I would assume. But I like to add some, like, for instance, I like having some receding elements, like the hair here. Like, I could have left it just dark, same darkness as here, down here, but I wanted to add a little bit of a textural gradient to it in order to help the character feel like they're part of the background and the surrounding area, but also it's a mood thing where it kind of creates this wispy, eerie mood. And I don't always stick to one established color scheme. I sometimes utilize color a bit to enhance what's going on mood-wise. So here I added a lot of blue, which was a very intentional choice, and I added like this really icy kind of blue, and it, obviously there's some tragic stuff going on, and here I pretty much removed the background, or like I didn't worry about the background at all, and just focused on the characters because of the emotional context of the scene. And you can also see how with the speech bubbles they kind of take you where you need to go as well. And so I don't want to make this super long, so I'll try to go through the rest of them a bit more quickly, but I think this is a decent example of a page where, it might sound like it's just too much to think about or to consider or to worry about when I'm talking about all these things like leading lines and the composition and all that and whatever, but it's actually, it does end up working out more intuitively than you'd think. So because obviously the primary concern is to draw the characters doing what they're supposed to be doing in the script, and who knows what that's going to look like. But certain decisions like how zoomed in you're going to be on their faces, or where you're going to place certain elements, it just ends up working out for whatever reason most of the time. Like here this arm is just kind of pointing towards the next panel that you're supposed to look at over here, and then again you have a little bit of a scoop into the next panel, and it just ends up working out. I think when you really tune in into a story and you really care about showing it as well as you can, things just sort of start to work together, without having to think about it too much. That's, I don't know if that's always true, but yeah, again, here, another example of just some lines taking, eyes on an angle, again, on an angle here, and then just leading you straight to the page. So there's like a bit of a squiggle going on, and yeah, that's a pretty common occurrence in my pages, and I really like the look, and I think it is much more effective than the type of paneling that I did for Grimoire Noir, because I feel like for Grimoire Noir, I was a little more utilitarian with the panels, and also the script contained a lot of things that weren't my choices, and obviously I had to like include all of it, and sometimes I needed to add extra things in order to make sure there's clarity and everything is apparent, like what's happening. There's no jumps, so that made paneling a little bit more difficult. But when everything was up to me and I was able to picture the scene as I was writing the script, I think it created a much more cinematic effect that allowed me to panel things in a much, more impactful way, if that makes sense. And so I've mentioned a bunch of times that a lot of contrast is usually where the focal point will be and where the eye will go, but I also figured I would mention framing elements, like for instance, in scenes like this where there's scenery, like foliage and whatnot, I like to use trees as a framing element to also help kind of zero in on where you need to be looking. And for instance, over here, I always feel like it adds a lot to just put some trees in order to create almost like a visual vignette to further, I don't know, frame what you're supposed to be looking at. So that creates a ton of atmosphere. I really like using trees as these framing elements. And so we're pretty much at the end of the prologue here, and I probably should have put a warning to that this is going to spoil, but whatever, it's just 18 pages, and you can always go read it at glowingveil.com. And I'll say this here, if you're interested to know what happens next, I've actually, like I mentioned earlier, started posting new pages on my Patreon page. So if you like the look of this project, if you're interested in it, you want to know what happens, please consider supporting me on Patreon, because it's the only thing I'm working on right now. And obviously, as you can see, it's a ton of work, and I've quit all my other stuff in order to make it happen. So if you're interested, please check it out. I'll be posting weekly pages. I just started posting weekly pages last week, and I'm far enough into the first chapter that that's going to continue for a while until further notice. So there's that. And one thing I wanted to mention about this page is actually, I was talking about tonal, using tones and like shadows and lighting in order to enhance the storytelling. So this is actually a panel, this one right here, where I kind of deviated slightly from my initial plan. And if I was to go back and fix something in this panel, I know exactly what I would do. So initially, I had this idea that obviously you can see the silhouettes of the characters against the background, but then I really wanted to make it a stark difference between this background and this background. So this main character being led in this direction, and I wanted this direction to just turn into complete darkness. And I completely forgot about that when I was drawing this, because obviously this is such a lengthy process, and it takes so long to draw these pages, and I don't work one page from start to finish at a time. I work in batches of like steps, so sometimes by the end I feel a little bit fatigued and I forget certain things, and it becomes a little more difficult to concentrate on initial intent. And so that's something I missed in this panel, which is something I haven't even noticed until now when I'm really like analytically looking through it. But, you know, it's not the end of the world, because I essentially had the same thing going on in the next final page of the prologue, where you have this area that's a lot lighter in the foreground, and obviously the contrast of the white dress against this utter darkness that's behind the characters. And one of the characters is already partially engulfed in the shadow. So it's fine. It's perfectly communicated here, which is obviously, it's a storytelling element. And yeah, I don't know. I think I've pretty much come to the end of everything that I wanted to tell you guys about the prologue in terms of composition and lighting. And I think in a future video soon, I will go over the detail, like the technical process of how I go about getting from line work to finalized, colored, and lit or finished pages, because I finally have some footage of that, which is from the first chapter. But yeah, I really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. I enjoyed talking about this. Please let me know if there's anything else specific that you want me to talk about or discuss, or just like tell you about my approach when it comes to comics or anything art related. And thank you so much for watching, if you watched till the end. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do. And I have a ton of older videos about comics, illustration, and all sorts of other things, both digital and traditional. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!